What is the effect of the Espionage Act of 1917 on American life today? Join me in this week's Libertarian Angle as I examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that y'all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy. I don't have my co-host this week, Richard Ebeling. He's preparing for classes that are starting up at the Citadel again. So you get a solo performance this week, and I want to talk to you all about something that's in the news, and that's the Espionage Act, specifically with respect to the FBI raid on former President Trump's home there in Florida. The news media and the FBI and so forth are talking about possible violations of the Espionage Act. Well, I wrote an article about the Espionage Act back in 2019 calling for its abolition, its repeal. This is a law that dates back to World War I, and it's a catch-all type of law. You could prosecute anybody for any sorts of things. It's the best kind of law from a prosecutorial or a gubernatorial standpoint, because you can it's like this huge grab bag of things that you can go after somebody on a criminal basis. Now, ordinarily, you'd think that the Espionage Act deals with spying, right? I mean, that if somebody spies for a foreign government against the United States, they're going to go after them. Now, keep in mind, of course, that U.S. officials don't have anything against spying per se. It's only when they're spying for a foreign regime. But they themselves get spies, and they get spies inside foreign regimes, and they treat those spies as heroic and glorious kind of people. But in any event, they raid President Trump's home there in Florida, and it's caused all kinds of ruckus. Well, Rand Paul, the U.S. Senator from Kentucky, tweets out a message that says, well, why don't we just abolish the Espionage Act? And he links to my article that was done in 2019. Well, this created quite a media stir. My article has been mentioned in Newsweek and Business Insider, of course, Reason Magazine, a libertarian publication, but all kinds of mainstream media outlets that actually, some of which have talked about the substance of my article. I mean, it's a classic example of where the pure libertarian position suddenly, unexpectedly, hits the mainstream news media, and that's, of course, thanks to Rand Paul. So I want to talk to you about that and the various aspects of the espionage law and why it really should be abolished, and that hopefully more people will consider abolition, especially as they get exposed to the article that I wrote back in 2019. It was actually reprinted yesterday on the leftist website Counterpunch that oftentimes reprints some of our articles at FFF. One of the things that fascinated me about the news media coverage of my article was the critics. One conservative critic made an interesting comment. He says, well, he was criticizing Rand Paul's idea of abolishing the Espionage Act, and he says, oh, well, why don't we just abolish all the laws then? I mean, he's clearly being sarcastic, but that mindset is so fascinating because it really is characteristic of the conservative mindset. The conservative mindset is that all laws that are passed by the federal government are good laws, that we live in a democracy, and that it's bad to be questioning any law that's passed by the democracy. Notice that it doesn't occur to this guy that there's a third alternative here. One alternative is abolish all the laws. Another alternative is to keep all the laws. Well, there's a third alternative that let's get rid of the bad laws. You see, and that concept does not even occur to him. It's disloyal to question any particular law as being bad. And if there was ever a bad law, it's this particular law. But if we look back in history, there's been a lot of bad laws that have been enacted over the years. And of course, those laws are either repealed or they're declared unconstitutional. But this is the conservative mindset that it wants to conserve, it wants to preserve what exists in the status quo. It doesn't question, it doesn't challenge, it doesn't critically analyze, it doesn't ferret out which are the laws that are bad and which ones are good. It just automatically assumes, especially in the type of system we live under, which is a national security state type of system, that you don't question anything, especially when it relates to national security. That the Pentagon knows what it's doing, the CIA knows what it's doing, and this is the mindset. We have to defer to them, especially on matters of national security. So I brought up the notion of the white rose. Some of you know that I've written extensively on the white rose, and one of the news media outlets that talked about Rand Paul's tweet and my article actually delved into the white rose, which is great because it exposes more Americans to the story of the white rose. And to me, this is one of the greatest stories of courage and principle that has ever happened. I mean, it's a true story. You can read my article, The White Rose, A Lesson in Dissent, on the Future of Freedom Foundation's website at fff.org. When I discovered the white rose many years ago, I was just fascinated. This was a group of college students at the University of Munich in the midst of World War II, at the height of World War II, that began questioning not just the war, but the whole Nazi regime. And so they secretly and surreptitiously began publishing pamphlets called the White Rose, and their organization came to be known as the White Rose. And of course, they had to do it in secret, because if the Gestapo caught them, if Hitler caught them, they knew what the result was going to be. So they would distribute these pamphlets, like leave them at places for people to pick up, and they would sometimes travel by train to go to another city and leave them there so that they wouldn't get ferreted out there in Munich. And it was the first time that dissent had erupted publicly against the Hitler regime. Well, they were caught, and they were arrested, and they were brought before the Gestapo, and Hitler said, give them a trial right away, quick trial. And they were tried before what's called the People's Court, which was a tribunal system that was very similar to the type of tribunal system that the Pentagon and the CIA have established over at Guantanamo Bay for terrorists and people like that, treason, and so forth. And so there's a great movie called Sophie Scholl, The Final Days. She was one of the two college students that were leading this group. The other one was her brother, Hans Scholl. And I highly recommend this movie, Sophie Scholl, The Final Days, and especially the courtroom scene. That you see the judge there berating Sophie Scholl, as well as Hans and their best friend Christoph Probst, who had a family, and he got executed before his wife even knew that he had been arrested. But the courtroom scene is fascinating because the judge there is saying things like, you were brought up poorly. What kind of family would do this? And you're ingrates. You should be showing gratitude, supporting the government, supporting the troops. And they didn't see it like that at all. Sophie Scholl, it's great to watch the movie as to how she speaks back at this judge and says, essentially says, we're in the right here. It's you that's in the wrong. And, well, that takes a very independent mindset to be able to stand against a government with omnipotent powers and to say, you are in the wrong. Most Germans could not do that. And that's the problem with most Americans. Americans can't do that either. Now, they'll look at the White Rose and they'll say, oh, God, what a courageous group of students, and they'll commend them and they'll praise them and so forth. But over here, they wouldn't dare think of taking the same position that the White Rose takes. In other words, they take the same position that the standard German took, that you got to support your government. Don't question anything, especially in time of war. And of course, we've got the perpetual war on terrorism, so the nation's perpetually at war. So when you're at war, you don't question, you don't challenge, you go along with everything. And that's this mindset with respect to the Espionage Act. That this is to protect America, that our national security is at stake, the terrorists are coming to get us, the communists are coming to get us, Saddam Hussein's coming to get us, the Russians are coming to get us, and before that the Soviets or the Chinese and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. Oh, the communist output 90 miles away that we still have this embargo against. You don't question any of this, okay? And you especially don't question the assassinations. I mean, if the CIA and the Pentagon deem it necessary to assassinate somebody, like they recently did by firing a missile in the middle of Kabul, Afghanistan, oh, no, you don't question that. No. That this is all designed to keep us safe and secure from the terrorists or the communists or the Muslims or the drug dealers, whoever the official enemy happens to be at the time. Well, that's not how a society gets healthy. A society gets healthy when you've got independent thinkers that are out there challenging things. And for example, in Russia right now, U.S. officials will praise, every conservative in the world will praise the dissidents that are criticizing Putin, his invasion of Ukraine, what's going on in Russia, and including the arrest of the dissidents. And every U.S. conservative will say, boy, they're great people. But then when you come over here and you start looking at people that are questioning the national security state here, oh, no. Let's not be disloyal here. You see, their mindset is exactly like Putin's, which is really ironic because, they criticize Putin so heavily, but yet they adopt his mindset here domestically by going after people that question bad laws like the Espionage Act. Now, the Espionage Act, like I said earlier, is just this dream come true for federal officials because they can go after just about anybody they want for anything they want. That when the Espionage Act was initially enacted in World War I, and let's step back a moment and talk about World War I. There's an old doctrine in the law called the fruit of the poisonous tree, where if you have like a bad search that arises from a bad affidavit on a search warrant or so forth, they're not going to let you bring any of that evidence in. It's the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine. You couldn't find anything more rotten, or you'd have a hard time finding something more rotten than U.S. interventionism in World War I. We had no business getting involved in World War I. And President Wilson intervenes in this war. He gets a declaration of war from Congress. At least they were still following the constitutional provision on declaration of war at that time. But still, even with a declaration of war, the U.S. should never have intervened. It was contrary to our enormously long heritage of non-intervention in the affairs of Europe and Asia, where all their forever wars go on. And Wilson said, well, we're going to bring American might here to finally bring an end to European wars. This was going to be the war to end all wars and also to make the world safe for democracy. I mean, democracy, as if that's sort of like this huge goal for liberty. Well, for one thing, democracy is not even in the Constitution, and the reason is because the framers understood that democracy can be a great threat to liberty. That's why the Bill of Rights protects us from democracy, because they knew the majority sometimes goes off in a bad direction. So the two goals that Wilson had were just ridiculous, and so he wastes tens of thousands of American lives for nothing, because at the end of the war, U.S. interventionism has brought the total defeat of of Germany, and that leads to the Treaty of Versailles, which was vengeful to the max. Even the defenders of interventionism said that the Treaty of Versailles was horrendous. And then Hitler uses the Treaty of Versailles as the way that he gets to power. he brings up all the resentments, including the war guilt clause and so forth, where they tried to pin the entire guilt for the war on Germany, when clearly there were a lot of other powers involved in bringing about the war. But Hitler used this, and so you've got this perverse result of U.S. interventionism indirectly giving the conditions that Hitler capitalizes on to get power. So, and of course, it didn't make the world safe for democracy. Yet Hitler's rise within about 20 years or so. It wasn't the war to end all wars, because we get World War II. So World War I is rotten to the core, and so I would argue that anything that comes out of World War I, including this Espionage Act, is the fruit of this poisonous tree, this rotten tree. They need to get rid of everything involved with World War I. Now, when the Espionage Act was enacted, they used it to jail critics of the war. You see, they sort of knew deep down inside that the war was rotten, that the U.S. should not be involved in it, because that's why they try to suppress criticism of it. If you think you're doing the right thing, you don't worry about people criticizing it. But deep down, they knew they were doing something rotten, and so they said, we're going to put anybody in jail that questions this war. And they do. They prosecute people for questioning the war, questioning the draft. Now, here's another aspect of this. They had a draft in World War I, which means they're forcing American men to go out and fight and die in this war. Now, when you got to force people to fight and die in a war, that's a pretty good sign that that's a rotten war. If it's a good war, if it's a defensive war, you don't have to force anybody. They're there to defend their families, to defend their country. But when you go over there and get involved in a war to make the world safe for democracy, thousands of miles away, people are not enthusiastic about giving up their lives for these grandiose, ridiculous goals. So they said, you can't criticize the draft. You can't criticize conscription here, forcing people to go fight in this rotten war. And they actually jailed people. They prosecuted them, and they convicted them in the Supreme Court in what would foreshadow the extreme deference to what became known as the national security state after World War II. The Supreme Court goes along with all this. I mean, it really goes to show you that when during time of war, the Constitution goes silent. The Supreme Court's not going to get involved with challenging or questioning anything that is flagrantly unconstitutional. I mean, what could be more unconstitutional under the First Amendment, freedom of speech, than to be putting people in jail for criticizing a war or criticizing a draft? But they did it, and the Supreme Court upheld it. And so it was a very oppressive law. Well, it kind of sits around for a while. They leave it on the books. They removed the sedition part of the law, the idea of criticizing the government. But they leave this thing there, and then it's rediscovered when people start disclosing, whistleblowers start disclosing the dark side aspects of the national security state. Now, what's a national security state? Well, it's the type of government we live under today, and we have lived under this type of governmental structure since the end of World War II. It wasn't always that way. America started out as a limited government republic. That was our type of governmental system. That's a government with limited powers. They're restrained by the Constitution. They're constrained by the Bill of Rights. And there's virtually full transparency in government operations. That was our system of government for some 150 years. Then after World War II, they convert the federal government into what is known as a national security state. This is when we get the vast permanent military establishment, the Pentagon, the defense contractors, the defense industry. We combine that with foreign interventionism, which was again contrary to the original foreign policy of the United States, non-interventionism, which had lasted some 100 years or so. And now they've got the CIA with omnipotent dark side powers, including the power of assassination, indefinite detention, kidnappings, all these dark side powers that the communists were wielding and exercising. And the argument was, well, if they're wielding these powers, our government has to wield them too, because if it doesn't, if we remain a limited government republic, the communists are going to beat us in the Cold War. They claim that there was this international communist conspiracy that was based in Moscow especially the conservatives and the right wing were maintaining that this conspiracy existed, that it was manifesting itself in a communist outpost 90 miles away from American shores. That was Cuba. Now you got the whole Cuban embargo idea of targeting the Cuban people with death and suffering, economic privation for the sake of regime change. So you've got this whole thing against Russia. The anti-Russia animus was going strong back then too, and the idea was that if we don't do this, convert the federal government to a national security state, we're going to lose. We're going to end up under communist control. They're going to be running the public schools and the interstate highway systems and so forth. Well, the irony of this is that the Soviet Union, Russia, had been an ally of the U.S. during World War II against the Nazis. But now the interventionists, the statists, they said, no, now we got to make them our official enemy. And so you've got this huge anti-Russia animus that was even arguably bigger back then than it is today. I mean, what we've gone through today is just a repeat of what went on throughout the Cold War era. Well, the national security state, the implicit bargain that was made with the American people is that, look, we got to do some dark side stuff here, much like the communists are doing, but we're going to keep it secret from you. And so that your consciences don't have to be bothered. We're going to do the dirty work and you just go about your daily lives. Well, along comes a guy like Julian Assange, and I point this out in my article in the Espionage Act, that releases this tons of dark side activity on the part of the national security state. And nobody says he's lying. Everybody agrees he was telling the truth, that he was just disclosing the truth about these dark side activities. And especially with respect to the U.S. war in Iraq, which was a war against a country that had never attacked the United States. It was a clear act of a war of aggression, type of war that was condemned as a war crime at Nuremberg. They just attack a country for the sake of regime change. And they kill multitudes of people. They wreak death and destruction all across the country, just like Russia's doing in Ukraine. I mean, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I mean, they may have even copied the model. The model was the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and of course the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the one that lasted 20 years, where I would say 99% of the people they killed there had nothing to do with 9/11. Massive death and destruction. And so here's a guy like Assange with WikiLeaks that's revealing these dark side secrets. And then there's Edward Snowden, who's he's working within the bowels of the national security state. He realizes that the NSA is doing some really illegal, unconstitutional stuff on a secret basis, mass secret surveillance on the American people. And so he decides in a crisis of conscience that he needs to let people know about this. Well, from the mindset of the national security state and the mindset of practically every conservative, these are bad people. You see, they don't recognize them as white rose kind of people. They recognize them as bad people, as spies. Now, neither one of these guys is spying for Russia or China, Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. They're just releasing information. But they go after them. And guess what they do to go after them? You got it. Hey, let's just pull out this whole 1917 law, the Espionage Act. You know, that's a form of spying, you know, releasing information, because you see, the dark side information, when you release it to the public, is going to the communists and it's going to the adversaries and the opponents. And so that's sort of like spying, right? And so you've got this law that, hey, man, we can not only put people in jail for criticizing the government, but now we'll use it for people that are going to reveal the dark side secrets of the national security state. I mean, that's quite a law. I mean, it can do whatever you want it to do to go after somebody. Well, then you've got this FBI raid on former President Trump. Now, let me say something about Trump. You know, okay, I'm a libertarian. I'm no fan of Trump. He's a dyed-in-the-wool conservative. And I agree with what some of his critics say, that if he's elected president, I mean, his authoritarian, dictatorial propensities are ominous and dangerous. But it's not. He isn't really the problem. The problem is the structure of the government. That when you have a giant government, a national security state type of government, along with a big welfare state type of government, which both leftists and conservatives support, you're going to attract people that love dictatorial power. You're going to attract people like Biden and Trump, which there's really no difference in principle between the two of them. I agree with them that Trump displays these authoritarian dictatorial propensities that are very dangerous when you've got a government that wields omnipotent power like this. But nonetheless, the man's got a right to run for office again, and that's what this is all about. The left is trying desperately, and some conservatives are trying desperately to keep him from running. The same way that Putin keeps his opponents from running. I mean, this is what's another irony in this thing is sort of hypocritical. They criticize Putin for jailing his opponents. Well, Putin doesn't just jail them. He actually has them charged with crimes, these businessmen that are rising up to oppose him and maybe run against him. And he charges them with financial crimes, and he convicts them with tax evasion or some regulatory violation and sends them to jail. So, it all has the appearance of normality, Well, that's exactly what they're doing over here. They're figuring out every way they can to do what Putin does to his opponents. They're trying to figure out how to do that to Donald Trump. How do they keep him from running again? And they're using they use the impeachment process, and twice or so. And now they've got, regulatory tax violations supposedly in New York that some leftist prosecutors investigating. They've got him investigating on the election stuff in Georgia. I mean, they are using the criminal process to get him prosecuted and convicted so that he can't run again. Presumably can't run again. I think this Espionage Act is the one where if they convict him of that, then he's precluded from running again. But they're doing everything they can to keep him from running again, just as Putin does to his opponents. Well, this is shameful. This is absolutely shameful. I mean, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. He's got a right to run again, and to use the criminal justice process for this. But let me tell you something. That they will never forgive Trump, because in the run-up to the election, Trump questioned, challenged, and mocked and ridiculed some of the stuff the national security state was doing. Like he mocked George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq, and suggested that this was a wasteful thing, and he mocked the CIA and the military establishment. Well, this was a super no-no. You don't do this. And even though he tried to make amends, he became president. He goes over to the CIA. He bends the knee, kisses their ring, and essentially says he's sorry. He surrounds himself with generals. He gins up a crisis with China, with the trade war. He gins up a crisis with North Korea, and but they won't forgive him, and they will never forgive him. They have to send a message. This is what happens to anybody that takes us on, even in an indirect way, by criticizing what we do. That's why they're going after Snowden. That's why they're going after Assange. They have to send a message to everybody else. Don't you ever, ever think of doing this, because this is what we're going to do to you. And this is the same thing with Trump. They will not let up. The FBI, the Pentagon, the CIA, the left, that they will do everything they can to send a message. Don't ever let a presidential candidate, or much less a president, do this again. Now, Trump was the first president since John Kennedy that had questioned, even in an indirect way, the national security state. John Kennedy was the one that did it before him, and he took him on directly. We all know what happened to him. And so no president since then has dared to take on the national security state till Trump, but then Trump caved, and he let the CIA keep all their assassination-related records secret, or most of them, gave them what they wanted, deferred to the military on what it wanted. So he became a deferential president in terms of the national security state, much as the Congress is deferential to the Pentagon and the CIA and the NSA, and the Supreme Court is too. But they won't forgive him. So what are they going after him now? Well, the Espionage Act. Now, Now, remember, they were at first suggesting that Trump was an agent of the Russians, that he was going to, he was like Dr. Strangelove type mindset, that he was, coming over here to be an agent. He wanted to become president so he could serve the Kremlin. And it was just pure conspiratorial nonsense. And so that, but they impeach him and so forth, saying, oh, he's acting like on Russia's behalf and so forth. Well, now they're going after him for mishandling classified information. Well, this is just pure nonsense. I mean, everything's classified in a national security state. Everything's secret. Remember, I told you that when we had a a limited government republic, we had transparency in the government. Everybody could see what government's doing. Well, not anymore. With a national security state, everything's secret. I probably should mention, I think it's worth mentioning, that Russia's a national security state too. So is Cuba, so is North Korea, and so is China. So is Saudi Arabia, for that matter, that murderous regime. So they're going after him for mishandling classified information. Well, this is a sham. And Jim Bovard, who's our policy advisor at FFF, writes for us every month. He wrote a fantastic article in the New York Post the day after the raid on Trump's home in Florida. And I highly recommend you read this thing because it gets to the real bottom of what's going on here with this sham FBI raid to get classified information. Just Google Bovard classified New York Post, and you'll find the article there. It's really worth reading. A very insightful article. And in fact, it attracted Donald Trump Jr.'s attention because he ended up tweeting out Bovard's article. But Bovard shows that, this classified stuff is just pure nonsense. They enforce it in an arbitrary and capricious way. They let some presidents get away with it, other presidents not. You can look at other instances of people that are not president, like Petraeus, the general that was giving classified information to his girlfriend, that they gets away with a slap on the wrist, with a misdemeanor, big deal. So it's the way it's enforced is very arbitrary and very capricious. But most of this stuff doesn't need to be classified. It's just this whole national security mindset. This is what the conversion to a national security state did to America. And I've said before, and I'll say it again, the worst mistake the American people ever made in our history was to convert the federal government from a limited government republic to a national security state. I mean, you remember what Franklin said when somebody said, "What kind of government are you giving us, Mr. Franklin?" Ben Franklin, and he says, "A republic, if you can keep it." Well, we didn't keep it. We abandoned the republic type of government, which had transparency, limited powers, and embraced a national security state form of governmental structure with omnipotent powers, including the power of assassination. I mean, you've got a Fifth Amendment that says no life shall be taken without due process of law. Due process of law means an indictment, a trial. You can't kill anybody until you give them an indictment and a trial. And that means foreigners as well. It says no one, no person. So our framers, our American ancestors, didn't want a government that had the power of assassination. It's clear. But that's what we got. I mean, like this assassination in Afghanistan, there's no due process there. It was a vengeful killing. They said, well, this guy was part of the 9/11 gang, even though much of the evidence points to Saudi Arabia, which, of course, they don't want to delve into at all over there because that's the one that produces the oil for the massive warfare machine that the Pentagon and the CIA run worldwide. So they just go and assassinate this guy. Well, that's the type of government that our founding fathers, our ancestors, did not want and refused to have for 150 years or so until this omnipotent power comes in. You've got Gitmo, where they've got indefinite detention, just like in communist countries. They got torture, just like in communist countries. They got military tribunals that are kangaroo tribunals, just like the one that convicted Hans and Sophie Scholl of treason for daring to criticize the government, much like the U.S. government used the Espionage Act to go after critics of World War I. So really the ultimate solution to this is not only to repeal the Espionage Act. What Americans have to do is think at a higher level. We're in a deep morass in this country, in case you haven't noticed. You got out of control spending and debt. The federal government's debt is what, 30 trillion or so? What does that amount to? 200 and some odd $1,000, $260,000 or so per taxpayer. That's a lot of money, or per family. I'm not sure which one it is. That's a lot of money to put on your balance sheet as a liability. And you've got the Federal Reserve printing the money up to pay off this thing. You've got this crisis that NATO has ginned up with Russia that gets us perilously close to nuclear war. Now they're ginning up another crisis with Taiwan. What they do is they find these little vulnerabilities, these red lines that these nuclear powers set forth, and then they just push that red line to create new crises and new crises and new crises to justify the ever-increasing expenses of the national security establishment. And in the midst of this, the country is like falling from the inside. The rot's from the inside. The threat is not Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba. The threat is right here. And our ancestors understood that. That's why they had a limited government republic. They didn't trust government powers. They didn't trust big standing armies, big military intelligence establishments. They knew that it would end up bankrupting the country, if not worse. They understood this was the gravest threat to the freedom and well-being of the American people. And that's the level Americans need to think at, the white rose level, where they're not afraid to challenge and criticize and analyze the structure of government and the bad laws that have come with this structure, including the Espionage Act. So with that, I'll wrap things up. Thank you again for tuning in, and to get more articles of a principled nature, come to the Future of Freedom Foundation's website, fff.org. Subscribe to our daily FFF Daily, which we have long strived, over 20 years now, to make the best daily libertarian commentary page on the internet. And we've got our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. We're putting together a conference for the fall on ending the Fed and ending inflation, restoring sound money to this country. So you'll get more information on that. That'll start about the first part of October. So thanks for your great support. We got a fundraiser out here mid-year that would greatly appreciate your support. Anything you can do to help us out, we'd be very, very grateful. You guys have kept us going now for 32 years, and we're really grateful, and I hope our work has merited your continued confidence and support. Thanks so much, and hope you have a great rest of the summer.